When I first wrote Three Cups of Tea, I picked the title in honor of a village chief in a very remote village in Pakistan. His name is Haji Ali. And he said, if you want to do business here, you need to have 3 cups of tea. And the first cup, you're a stranger. Second cup, a friend. And third cup, you become family. And for our family, we're prepared to do anything, even die. But the publisher, Viking, in New York, they decided to pick the subtitle of the original book. And they wanted to be one man's mission to fight terrorism one school at a time. And although I'm a military veteran, I was very opposed to that because I said the reason I do this is to promote peace. My parents were educators, my grandparents were educators, and I had come from I found out my great-great-great-something grandfather who came from northern Norway, Tromsø, he had set up a school when they first came over in 1863 here in the US. So education kind of runs in the genes. Well, they disagreed with me, so finally I got the courage to go to New York, and it was very frightening because it was my first time in the big city, and I summoned a jirga, it's like a tribal conference, and the CEO of 18 publishing houses, the head of marketing and head of publicity, about 12 people, and I tried to, I'm this kind of little guy from Montana, and I tried to very eloquently state my case of why I want the subtitle to be One Man's Mission to Promote Peace, One School at a Time. Well, when I got done, they said, Greg, this is your first book, so you need to learn a few things about the publishing industry. Number one, only 1 out of 8 nonfiction books makes a profit, and 2/3 of all bestsellers are pre-chosen by the publisher. So we'd like to promote your book, but you need to be fighting terrorism so we can pitch the media, and then your book will do just fine. Well, finally I conceded, but if you work in Pakistan or Afghanistan for a long time, you never settle a deal without driving a hard bargain on the side. So I said, if the hardcover doesn't do well, I want the paperback subtitle changed to One Man's Mission to Promote Peace, One School at a Time. So the hardcover came out in 2006. It didn't do very well. And in December 2006, Paul Slovak, the new editor, after relentless pressure from Julia and Abdul and me and other people, they said, we're going to change the subtitle to One Man's Mission to Promote Peace, One School at a Time. So the new subtitle book came out in January 2007, and now it's been a New York Times bestseller for 108 weeks straight in a row. And the real message is that fighting terrorism is based in fear, but promoting peace is based in hope. And the real enemy, whether it's in Africa or Afghanistan or here, Pakistan or here in the US, the real enemy is ignorance, and it's ignorance that breeds hatred. And to overcome ignorance, we need to have compassion, we need to have courage, we need to build relationships, and I guess we might have to sit around and drink some tea and get to know each other a little bit more in this world. I'm also, this fighting terrorism that I was talking about, I often recall a quote by Martin Luther King who said, even if the world ends tomorrow, I'm still going to plant my seed today. It doesn't really matter what's going to happen today. I'm going to go out and make a difference in the world. When I was 3 months old, my parents were from Minnesota, but they took us to Africa, where I grew up for 14 years. And it was a wonderful place to grow up. I called it paradise. It was post-colonial, it was a new democracy, and there was a lot of infusion of Arabic and German and Italian and Portuguese and the African culture. It's a very rich culture. I also got to go to school with children from 24 different countries. I got to go to school with Muslims and Jews and Christians and Hindus and Sikhs and Buddhists. So to me, that was the way the world was. My father originally was a teacher, but then he decided to start a medical center called the Kilimanjaro Christian Medical Center. Along with a German from Berlin named Otto Walter, they set up the Good Samaritan Foundation, and they ended up building the Kilimanjaro Christian Medical Center. One thing my father always insisted on, though, was that local people be in charge. And that often got the Americans and the Europeans quite mad at my father. They said, we need a mzungu, excuse my expression, but we need a white man in charge. And my father always insisted on having Tanzanians in charge. Well, when the hospital finally opened in '71, my father got up and gave a speech, and he said, in 10 years, all the department heads of this hospital will be from Tanzania. And he said, we're so proud that you now have your hospital that you've established. Well, we came back to the States, and my father died in his mid-40s from cancer, but we got the annual report from the hospital 10 years later, and all the department heads were from Tanzania. And even today, 38 years later, all the department heads of the hospital are from Tanzania. When finally came time to come back to the States, I was very excited. I was in high school. I wanted to play football and have 4th of Julys and fireworks and all those good things we have here in the U.S. But my first day in high school in St. Paul, Minnesota, I got beat up. The kids put a garbage can over my head and they started pounding on me. And it was because I made a mistake. I said I'm African, and there was a lot of confusion about that. And you know, it's okay to laugh because it was the first time in my life that I learned what the word racism meant. And it wasn't Africa, it was here in the U.S. 4 days after high school, in June of '75, I did something that was very unpopular at the time. I joined the U.S. Army. It was right after the Vietnam War. And I did it not only to serve my country, but to get the GI Bill so I could go to college. We were very poor, and my grandparents had been in the military, so I decided to join the Army. I spent 2 years in Germany, in Bamberg, working as a medic, but what really impressed upon me is that I realized in the military, there's people come from all different backgrounds and different parts of the country, and I realized that this is a great country, not because of our commonality, but because of our great diversity. In Africa, there's a proverb, and if you can remember just one thing today, remember this very beautiful African proverb. It says, if we educate a boy, we educate an individual. But if we educate a girl, we educate a community. So in Africa, all my sisters were born in Tanzania. And my youngest sister, her name was Krista Eliana. And Eliana in Kichaga means gift of God. And she was a very special girl, but it was because she suffered from severe epilepsy. She never complained, and she had to struggle a lot with all her daily activities. She took a lot of medication to suppress her seizures. So learning was very hard for her, to learn how to read and do math, and she never even figured out how to add money like quarters and dimes and nickels and dollars. And Krista, though she never complained, and she inspired all of us who knew her. Well, in 1992, Krista saw the baseball movie called Field of Dreams that takes place in a cornfield in Iowa. And she was very impressed, she was very inspired by it. So for her 23rd birthday, she was going to go from the Twin Cities down to Dyersville, Iowa, where the baseball movie was filmed in a cornfield. She packed her bags, but when my mother went to wake up Krista in the morning, Krista died in her sleep from a massive seizure. We were all devastated, so at the time I decided I would climb K2, the world's second highest mountain, to honor her memory. And K2, I picked it because it's a very difficult, challenging mountain to climb. And Krista had an amber necklace that she'd gotten in Africa, so I decided to put that amber necklace on top of K2, and that would be a very fitting way that I could honor my sister Krista. Well, finally, a year later, I went to Pakistan, and I arrived in the Karakoram or Karakoram mountain range. And Karakoram in ancient Turkish means black rubble. But the Karakoram are definitely not any piece of black rubble. This is the greatest consolidation of high peaks in the world. There are 64 peaks above 23,000 feet high in a 100-mile area. So the next time you go down, is it 101? When you're in Boston, the roads don't go in straight lines, so I have to say go in a circle, but clock yourself 5 miles and then pretend you're going straight up, and that's how high these peaks are in the Karakoram range. This is K2, the world's second highest mountain. You can put 84 Matterhorns inside of K2 to fill it up, just to give you a size of the scale of it. And the first attempt was by the Duke of Abruzzi, an Italian. In 1909, he reached halfway up on the right-hand side. He was wearing hobnail boots, and being a gentleman, he wore a tweed jacket and a tie, and he was eating cans of sardines. 100 years later, I can just imagine somebody trying to climb K2 in a tweed jacket and tie. We didn't have a lot of money. I was living in the Bay Area, so we bought 2-season family camping tents from Wilderness Exchange. It's a secondhand store in Berkeley, California. And if you look in the green tent in the right foreground, it's a French Legionnaires tent designed for the Algerian desert in the Sahara. And the yellow tent in the front is called a wind tunnel. It's the original north face prototype tent developed over in Berkeley. It was about 20 years old when we used the tent on K2. Here's our motley crew of 12 climbers. We were called the Rejects because we didn't have a lot of funding, but we were very ferociously determined to get to the top of K2. Also, the gentleman in the middle, I won't tell you where he's from, but without the shirt on, the guy there who's culturally insensitive, but he left after 1 week because he said there's no alcohol in Pakistan. That's a true story. This is an avalanche, and just to give you a size of this, if you look way down in the right foreground, you can see some little blue tents, and if you look more closely with a magnifying glass, you can see 4 Spanish men in their underwear running out of the tents. Now, fortunately, nobody was killed in this avalanche. So we worked our way up the West Ridge. We had a Pakistan visa, but we didn't have a Chinese visa. So you can see our route here is on the left-hand side is China, and on the right-hand side is Pakistan. But we didn't see any gun-toting Chinese border guards, so we went illegally into China, and then we went back into Pakistan to make a legal ascent of K2. So finally, 78 days later, it was time to go home. I didn't quite make it to the top, and my 2 partners, they actually did summit. So I was very disappointed, and I felt as if I'd let my sister down. And those of you who've read 3 Cups of Tea, except for Julia and Abdul and Bob here, can any of you remember what the first chapter is called? It's an F word that we don't like to talk about here in the US. Failure, good. Sometimes there's like 3,000 or 4,000 people and nobody remembers the first chapter. And I think it's a very important word. And when I submitted the manuscript to New York, Manhattan, they said, Greg, in the US, you never start a book with the word failure. It's bound to fail. But you know, we all make mistakes in our lives, and sometimes we all fail. Some of us burn cookies in the oven. Some of us fail in our tenure. Some of us fail in our academic studies. Some of us fail in relationships. I was in New York, when were we there, Julie, about a month ago? Right near Wall Street, and I mentioned that some of us fail in our investments, and there was absolutely no laughter there. Did you hear, you remember, Julia? It was like dead silence. I thought, oh dear. So the next time, you know, and I'll just share with you one example. When I turned 16, I went to take my driver's license test. We were very poor. We were living in Minnesota. We had a little Honda Civic. And in Minnesota, they use salt on the freeway. And our whole dashboard had worn away. So when you drive down the freeway, you could see the road going underneath your feet. Anyways, I went to parallel park the car for my driver's test, and I hit the accelerator instead of the brakes, and I totaled the family car. So how many of you out there flunked your first driver's license test? Okay, give them all a big round. All right. So next time you fail, think of this very beautiful Persian proverb that says, when it is dark, you can see the stars. So here we are leaving K2. That's John on my left and Dan on my right, and me with a t-shirt on. I had to walk about 80 kilometers or about 50 miles. I was very weak. I had to carry about 90 pounds, about 40 kgs, and I was struggling along. 5 days walking, and I stumbled, I got lost, and finally I stumbled into a little village called Corfe. When I got to the village, there was a very elderly, stout, squat man with a silver beard. His name is Haji Ali. He's the village chief. First he met me and he said, Assalamu alaikum, meaning peace be with you. Then he looked at me and he shook his head and he said, Cheezele. Now being from the Midwest, the best translation I can think of the word Cheezele is what the heck. And the reason he was looking at me is because, first of all, foreigners never came to this side of the valley, but also I was weather beaten, my pants were ripped, and I hadn't taken a bath in 84 days. He said, welcome to our village, but first you do need to wash. So he took me down to the icy river, Baralda River, and I washed up and I went to his house for tea. I have now spent 16 years working in rural Pakistan and Afghanistan. I've spent about 70 months in the field, and I've learned many things. 1 out of 3 or 4 children dies before the age of 1. The maternal mortality rate is staggering. About half the men, they leave the villages to go to the cities to work as dishwashers or road construction crews or menial type of labor, But who's left behind? It's the women, and the women tell me now their workload has doubled over the last 2 or 3 decades. And if you ask the men who do get a job, see, to get a job often have to pool their resources. They have to sell their goats or land to bribe somebody to get a job. A man who does get a job, he might earn only about $500 a year. So you ask that man, what do you buy with your money? Well, it's very prestigious for a man to come home with 50 or 40 bags of white flour. And what do they grow there? They grow buckwheat, barley, brown wheat, very nutritious things. So many things have changed in a village like Corfe. We also did a study of 18 women, their hemoglobin level in Corfe in 1998. Hemoglobin is red blood cell count level. Most of the women in Corfe had a hemoglobin of 8 to 9. And most of the women here, your hemoglobin is 12 to 14. And if your hemoglobin was 8, you'd be in an ambulance with a siren on going to get a pint of blood at San Francisco General Hospital or Daly City Hospital. And the reason the women are anemic is mostly because the men eat most of the protein, the eggs and the meat, and they don't share it with the women. So many things have changed in a village like Corfe. Well, I was a stranger, and they were a stranger to me. And we had yet to have 3 cups of tea with each other. And one day, they took me behind the village, and I saw 84 children sitting in the dirt during their school lessons. And although in Africa I saw a lot of poverty, when I saw those children, I realized why I'd come to Pakistan. It wasn't to climb a mountain, but to help the children who are riding with sticks in the sand. You know, today, there's a lot of study and theory, and they're even thinking about bailouts for how to solve the problem of poverty. But the only way we can solve poverty is that we have to touch poverty, and we have to smell poverty, and we have to taste poverty, and we have to be with poverty. And we can't solve poverty from a classroom or think tank in Washington, D.C. And what's been so inspiring to go around to universities and high schools, I was in Fremont School District yesterday and in Topeka, Kansas, and even here on the campus here, there is so much community service programs now in education. It's making a profound difference in the lives of young students and children. They can go out into the community. In Topeka, Kansas, they've been having a program for 20 years. There's kids who are going to prisons and working in battered shelters and working with pregnant teenagers, and they're going out and it's really making an impact on their lives to go out and live a life of service. Well, a young girl named Chocho came up to me and she said, could you help us build a school? So I made a promise that day and I said, I promise I'll build a school for you. I came back to the States and I had no clue how to fundraise, and I actually got a lot of flack for this the last few years, but you know, I had no clue how to fundraise, so I went to the local library and I had to raise $12,000. So is there any librarians in here? Okay, give them a big round there. And I don't know if you've been asked this before as a librarian, but I said, you know, I have this problem. I need to raise $12,000 to build a school in Pakistan, so what do you think we should do? So the librarian and I, we looked up the name of 580 celebrities and movie stars and sports heroes. And at the time, I didn't know how to use a computer, so I hand-typed 580 letters. Dear Michael Jordan. Dear Sylvester Stallone. Dear Terminator, you know, your governor here in California. And guess what happened? Nothing happened. And then at Christmas time, I got $100 from Tom Brokaw, the newscaster. Tom has been a big support with 3 Cups of Tea, and if you see the book, he's written a blurb on the front of the book, but he also is kind of avoiding me lately. Well, recently, he had us to his ranch for dinner. He's moved to Montana now, and he had us to his ranch for dinner. So I asked Tom, how come you're avoiding me lately? He said, well, Greg, I don't know quite what to do because lately a lot of people are coming up to me all over the place and in airports and asking me about this 3 Cups of Tea thing, and I'm really embarrassed because I only wrote you a $100 check, and you wrote about it. No, I didn't quite have the guts to tell Tom or ask him, you know, you could still write another check. I'm writing another book right now. And to add some insult to that, my daughter Amira, who sometimes joins us now when we go on the road, we were doing homework the other day, and she was kind of distracted, and she looked up at me, and she said, Daddy, I figured out that in 1993, you spent $128 on postage, and you only raised $100. Well, then I sold my car, I sold my climbing gear, I sold my books, and I love books, so I went to a Black Oak bookstore here in Berkeley, and you know, selling books at 90% off, even worse than college, buyback programs. And My mother, who's a principal at Westside, I'd only raised about $2,400. I was also working as a nurse because I had to get plane tickets and more other supplies and everything. So my mother, who was a principal at Westside School in Wisconsin, elementary school, she invited me to come and talk to the kids. I went there for 2 days, and it was the first time. I'm actually a pretty shy, reserved guy, so it was very frightening to go and talk to a bunch. It was the first time I talked to anybody. And heaven forbid I go to an elementary school to raise any money. But when I got ready to leave, a fourth grader named Jeffrey came up to me, and he looked at me deadpan. He said, "I have a piggy bank at home, and I'm going to help you." And I didn't think anything of it. And 6 weeks later, they had raised 62,340 pennies. And so that started out a program. Today, now we have 16 years later, a program called Pennies for Peace. And for lack of better words, it's kind of going bananas lately. We don't do any marketing with it. Last year, it was in 270 schools. This year, it's in 3,500 schools. And we think in the next year going to 15,000 schools. It's also in 19 countries around the world. So when kids get on a mission, the best thing to do is just stay out of the way. So instead of trying to control this program, we made it into a concept, and we've worked at the NEA for 2 years, and just last month they approved a curriculum, a standardized system with the Rubik system. So the Pennies for Peace program now can be incorporated into school curriculums. We have a elementary level, junior high level, and also high school level. I met an economist at San Diego State University last fall. He told me, and I don't know how I figured this out, but there is enough pennies in the U.S. that we could eradicate global illiteracy just with the pennies. We don't need any dollars, no bailouts, just pennies. There are 110 million children in the world today who can't go to school. They're deprived of education because of slavery, because of poverty, religious extremism, gender discrimination, corrupt governments. And that's the dilemma we have today. But there's also a solution, and I think that solution is to make our kids aware of what's going on in the world today and of the tremendous exploitation of children around the world. And if we don't really make education our top global priority, I don't think there's anything more important that we can do. So we're going to go back to '94 now. I went back to Pakistan, and I had also a big blessing. It seems like when things really get bad, then some little blessing comes along. And the blessing was in the form of a cantankerous Swiss physicist. His name is Dr. Jean Herny. And he was a pioneer of the microchip industry. In 1957, he invented the planar process, which was a prototype of the microchip. And Jean, he was he helped start a lot of the Silicon Valley efforts, but he also was very keen on what we were trying to do in Pakistan. And I can't do that Swiss French accent, but one day he called me up, and he said, I didn't know who he was, and he said, "Just what are you doing in the Pakistan Karakoram?" And trying to get a school built. And I said, I made a promise, and I want to make sure I fulfill my promise. So he asked me to promise that if he gave $12,000 to fund a school, would I make a promise I'd build it? And I said, yes, I will. So finally, that fall, I went back to Pakistan. I got the school supplies, and I got up to Corfe. But when I got to the village, Haji Ali again greeted me, "Assalamu alaikum." And then again, he shook his head, and he said, "Chizale." Because there's no phone there, there's no email, there's no postal system. So he said they were very surprised. They didn't think I was coming back. And not only that, I brought the school supplies. We said, if we're going to build a school, we have to build a bridge first. So I hadn't thought of that. So I had to come back to the States, and I raised $10,000 more. And I went back in '95, and in 10 weeks, they built a 284-foot span bridge over the Bralder River. And this is a remarkable engineering feat. If you look at that bridge, you can see 5 800-pound steel cables that they carried 18 miles up the mountain trails on big spools to get the bridge built. These are the men from Corfe carrying loads 18 miles up the mountain trails. These are the struts and beams and trusses for the roofs. And in the front, you'll see the gentleman in the front. His name is Sher Taki. He's the imam for the village. He's the head religious leader. I hope that, if there's any rabbis or ministers or priests or imams here, but in the Braldu, the imam is not supposed to do manual labor. he's supposed to be the spiritual advisor and read the Holy Quran and be the arbitrator and solve land disputes. Well, not only did Chertucky come down, he carried the first load back to the village, symbolizing his advocacy for education. We can see 3 years later, we hadn't gotten very far. And actually, the problem wasn't them, it was me. And I was doing something that we call in the U.S. micromanagement. I had my plumb line receipts and records, and I was determined to get this school built. One day, Haji Ali took me aside, and he sat me down. He said, if you want to build a school, you're going to have to sit down and let us do the work. And he said it in a lot harsher words than I can repeat here. Then he took my receipts, my plumb line records, he locked them up in his little earthen locker along with his prayer beads and Holy Quran. And then he came back and said, there, don't you worry, everything will be fine. And he used the word inshallah, meaning Allah willing. Well, of course, I was horrified. And guess what happened 6 weeks later? The school got built. And it was an important lesson to let go and empower, let the communities be in charge, just the same thing that my father had done in Africa. So today, all our schools, we provide skilled labor like carpenters, masons, materials, and most of all, what's important is teacher training. But the community has to provide free manual labor, subsidized labor, free land, free resources, free wood, so the community matches that. And what that does is it gets a local buy-in. This is an example on a micro scale, but you can also apply this on a macro scale. And one of my main criticisms about the reconstruction policy in Afghanistan, well, actually the global policy that was started in the Bonn conference in early 2002, is the way it was set up is centralized and deprovincialized. And if you look back in history, some of you might be familiar with the Marshall Plan after World War II. And if you study the Marshall Plan, I think it was a brilliant plan, and the architects who designed it were genius. But the main component of the Marshall Plan is that it was provincialized and decentralized. And in Afghanistan, we completely flipped that around, and only the last 2 years have we really started to change that around. It's what I call bottoms-up type of development. So in '96, I decided to dedicate my life to doing this, and the first thing that happened is I had a fatwa issued against me. And a fatwa is, what would you say, Abdul, like an edict? It's an edict. In my case, the fatwa was banishing me from the country because I was helping girls go to school. So I went to Syed Abbas Rizvi, who's the head imam in northern Pakistan. He's a very powerful man, but he's also a very visionary and wise and noble man. And I said, Syed Saab, whatever you decide, I'll respect your decision. So several months later, he summoned me into the inner sanctum of the Imam Bara Mosque in Skardu. It was very imposing. There was 8 imams, and most of them had a black turban on, which means they were descendant of Muhammad the Prophet. And I thought, I'm going to get booted out of the country. But instead, he brought me a red velvet box, and he opened it. And inside was a letter written in the ornate Farsi or Persian script. And it read, Bismillah al-Rahman al-Rahim, in the name of Allah, the Merciful, the Beneficial. We have reviewed your case, and in our Holy Quran, education is encouraged for all children. And furthermore, what this man is doing is in the highest principles of Islam. So we give our blessings and our support. And I also learned from Syed Abbas many things. In the Holy Quran, the first word of the revelation to Muhammad the Prophet is the Arabic word ikra. And ikra means read. And the first 2 chapters implore that all people have a quest for knowledge, to go out into the world and seek the truth. And that is in the teachings of the Holy Quran. You know, the more I do this, I'm convinced that the #1 global priority should be education, especially education for girls. We can drop bombs, and we can, all right. You know, we can drop bombs, we can hand out condoms, we can build roads, we can put electricity, which we're spending billions on, but unless the girls are educated, a society won't change. There are several global studies show, I've talked to people at the UN Population Center in New Delhi, or Amartya Sen, who won the Economics Nobel Prize in '98, who wrote a great book called Development is Freedom. The #1 way, if you educate a girl to at least a 5th grade level, there's 3 important things happen. #1, reduce infant mortality. #2, reduce the population explosion. And #3, improve the quality of health and life itself. There are also many other things that happen with girls' education. But I think #2 is very important. A good example is the country of Bangladesh. About 1970, the female literacy rate in Bangladesh was about 20%. And they launched a national initiative to have every single child in that country get an education, including girls. Today, the female literacy rate has tripled, and if you look at a population demographic curve in Bangladesh, you can see that the population is just now reaching an apex. Unlike Pakistan, the population is going to double in the next 27 years from 175 million to 350 million people. And the female literacy rate, if you count in all the factors in the rural areas, is about 38%. The government says 58%, but there's some discrepancy over what defines a literate person, and they don't go by the UNESCO standards. And the only thing that really is going to make that difference in Pakistan is female literacy and education. I also see when girls learn to read and write, they come home, they teach their mother how to read and write. And often you'll see a girl coming home and her mother asked her to write a letter to her family, because when a woman is married, often her maternal ties are severed and she cannot communicate with her family. I also see people coming home from the bazaar marketplace, and you'll see they have vegetables or meat wrapped in newspaper, and then the mother very carefully unfolds the newspaper and asks her daughter to read the news to her. It's the first time that woman is able to get news about what's going on in the world around her. And I know sometimes the women ask that when they come, the men usually go to the bazaar, but please wrap the vegetables in 5 layers of paper. I haven't heard this yet, but by the way, throw in the opinion page and editorial. That's when women really start to get to read. Also, when someone goes on jihad, and we need to clarify, I'll make sure I'm doing this right, but jihad means a struggle or quest. And a jihad is a noble quest. It could mean many, spiritual or some type of endeavor. But when someone goes on jihad, they first have to get permission from their mother. And if they don't, it's very shameful or disgraceful. If a woman has an education, she's much less likely to condone her son to get into violence or into terrorism. And that did happen after 9/11. The Taliban actually had a high desertion rate, but they were mainly targeting illiterate, impoverished society, often at gunpoint, because educated women were refusing to allow their sons to join the Taliban. And to even amplify that a little more, in some of the most, say, difficult areas, we hire former Taliban as teachers in our school. And people in the States sometimes don't like that. But the reason we do that is because they are our greatest advocates for education, and they are at great risk. The Taliban want them dead, but we use them to go out and advocate for education in very difficult, dangerous areas. I equate it to the same thing. If you want us to launch an anti-smoking campaign here at City College San Francisco, then I'm going to go get some ex-smokers to launch the campaign. Is that a good analogy? Okay, I'm with the academicians here, so you can let me know. But if you talk to those former Taliban who are now teachers, they all say the reason they got out of the Taliban is because their mothers did not support what they're doing, and their mothers said, what you're doing is not a good thing, so we want you to be doing something else. Now I've got some really good news, and I've got some really bad news. So do you want to hear the bad news first or the good news? Bad news, okay. So here's the bad news, and it's very tragic. The Taliban and other groups have bombed or destroyed, these numbers go up every day, over 500 schools in Afghanistan and over 200 schools in Pakistan. And that recently in Pakistan has been very dramatic. In the Swat Valley, dozens of girls' schools have been bombed or destroyed or shut down. But if you look at those schools, most of those schools, 80 to 90% are girls' schools. They're not boys' schools. So why do a group of men want to bomb a girls' school and not a boys' school? Because I think their greatest fear is not a bullet, but it's the pen. And what they fear the most is if that girl gets an education, grows up, becomes a mother, the value of education will go on in the community. Also, in the Hadith, a part of Islam, it says that the ink of a scholar is greater than the blood of a martyr, meaning that the pen is more powerful than the sword. Now here's the good news, and I'm going to ask this as a question also. So how many of you here know the fact that in the year 2000, 9 years ago, this is a UNESCO figure, there were 800,000 kids going to school in Afghanistan aged 5 to 15. Today, there are 7.2 million children in school in Afghanistan, including over 2 million females. Any of you here aware of that? You know, one person. Where'd you hear about it? You worked in Pakistan? Oh, that's good. I'm glad to see that you, thank you. It's very inspiring to see one person who knows about that. You know, in the last year, I've talked to over 400,000 people in the U.S., including the Pentagon, Capitol Hill, universities, think tanks, and everywhere. Only about 55 hands have come out of 400,000 people that are aware of that fact. Now, don't you think that's good news? It's actually, I was in Oslo, Norway a couple months ago at a education conference. This is the greatest increase in school enrollment in any country in modern history, and nobody in the U.S. is aware of it. In Europe, a few more people are aware of this, I was on Capitol Hill last month, and I was talking to a bunch of senators, U.S. senators, and I briefed them on this, and afterwards they were patting themselves on the back. And I said, how can you take credit for something you don't even know about? You know, but that's a politician for you. And of course, the U.S., you know, we can take some credit for this. Yes, that's great. But the real reason those people are in school, those children, is because the communities themselves, they want and they have this fierce desire for education. And everywhere I go, people, they say what we want is education. So this is just one example. This young woman, her name is Aziza. She's from the tribal areas on the Pakistan-Afghan border. And Aziza is a very special woman, a very courageous woman. She was the first young woman out of 4,000 people to get an education. It wasn't easy. When she was in elementary school, the boys threw stones at her because she was a girl going to school. When she got to high school, some of her teachers refused to teach her because she was female. In her valley, before she started working in 2000, there's no medicine, no clinic, no doctor. 5 to 20 women died in childbirth every single year. So Aziza graduated in 1998. She went to 2 years of maternal health care training, and she learned how to deliver babies and do pre- and postnatal care. She came back in 2000. It cost $800 to train her. Her pay is about $1.20 per day. Not one single woman has died in childbirth in the last 9 years because of a brave young woman named Aziza in that valley. I also get hundreds of letters from people serving in the military, not only from the U.S., but you know, the Norwegian forces, the British forces, and they pretty much say the same thing, that without education, nothing is going to change in a country like Afghanistan. General Petraeus, our CENTCOM commander, read 3 cups of tea, and I met him and Admiral Mike Muller, Joint Chief of Staff, and Admiral Eric Olson, who's our Special Forces commander. They've all read 3 cups of tea. And General Petraeus read 3 cups of tea last year, and then he sent me an email. I said, I've read your book, and I've learned 3 things from this book. And he summarized them in 3 bullet points. You know, he's a military general, so he sends you bullet points. Number 1, we need to listen. Number 2, we need to build relationships. And number 3, we need to have respect, meaning that we are there to serve the good people of Afghanistan. Today, 3 cups of tea is mandatory reading for all officers in the Pentagon going to counterinsurgency training. Also, our special forces going to Afghanistan, and now in the Norwegian War College, it's also a part of their required reading for Norwegian forces. And maybe in Germany we could, you know, it's not, I'm trying to pitch the book, but there's the lessons about building relationships, and maybe Japan too. So this is one example. This is Colonel Kalenda. He's just like any of us. He grew up on a farm in Nebraska. They were raising cattle and ranching, and he has 4 children. But he's basically a history master degree in history. But he's also an officer serving in the U.S. military. And he was, for 16 months until last August, the commander of Forward Operating Base in Nare in Kunar Province in eastern Afghanistan. It's one of the most difficult, dangerous posts to serve in Afghanistan. And several of his men were killed in firefights with the Taliban in Korangal and Kamdesh last summer. And he sent me an email about a year and a half ago, and I'll share it with you, and we've been in touch ever since then. He says, I am the commander. He identifies himself and where he was based. He says, our primary goal in this counterinsurgency is to provide hope for the good people of Afghanistan, particularly the children. And setting up schools is one of my top priorities. I am convinced the long-term solution to terrorism is education. The conflict here will not be one with bombs and bullets, but with books and ideas that excite the imagination towards peace, tolerance, and prosperity. People are tired of war, and they want a better future. And it is education that will make the difference, whether the next generation grows up to be educated patriots or illiterate fighters. The stakes could not be higher. These are some Afghan militia commanders, and except me in the middle there. And this picture is taken, I think, last September or August. And if you, on my left is Wood Khan, on my right is Sadr Khan, and these men, when they're about 12 or 13, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in '79, and they were yanked out of schools and given AK-47s, and they had to fight the Russians to defend their land as mujahideen or warriors. But they regret the fact that they never were to go back to school, and for 30 years now they've been fighting as soldiers. And if they invite you to their compound, they'll take you on the roof, and then they'll serve you green tea with a little sprig of mint in it, and then they'll share with you many of the stories that takes place in the mountains around their homes. And they'll point out to rocks and boulders and say, do you see those stones up there? Every one of those stones is a shaheed or martyr who died fighting the Taliban or the Russians or enemies. Now we must turn those stones into schools and make their sacrifice worthwhile. And what they're saying is, we have to do something to honor the death of our fellow mujahideen, and what we want is education. If you're in Afghanistan on Independence Day, they sometimes have a parade, and it's in August. It's very similar to 4th of July parade, but there's something a little bit unusual about that parade, because first the widows come, those who've lost their husbands who've died fighting, and then sometimes the orphans comes, and then the wounded veterans come in wheelchairs and in crutches, hobbling along, and then finally the snappy young soldiers come with their weapons. So can you imagine here in the U.S., if we had a 4th of July parade, and first our widows came, those who've lost their husbands or wives serving in Afghanistan or Iraq, and then the orphans came, and then our wounded veterans came in wheelchairs and in crutches and hobbling along, and finally an F-16 did a flyby. Now the reason they do that in Afghanistan is because they want to honor the sacrifice of those who paid the ultimate price. And what they ask is, on behalf of these even militia commanders, what we want most is education. Now, sometimes I hear Christian and Jewish and Muslim and Hindu and Buddhist leaders or other leaders say something like, God is on our side. But you know what? If God is on anybody's side, I think that God is on the side of the orphans, the widows, and the refugees. And until every single one of those 110 million children in the world today who are deprived of school can go to school, I don't think that any of us here has the right to say, God is on our side. So we're running, we have 78 schools. We're also running several other dozen schools. This is in Maidan Shah in Afghanistan. This is also a place where Julie has visited. This is an armored personnel carrier, 9th grade classroom inside are 12 9th graders. There are 80 second graders going to school in a steel truck container. This was used to bring over U.S. military supplies, and it was salvaged and converted into a classroom. And there are girls who have walked 2 hours to go to this school, and when they get to school, you see they take their shoes off. And it's not because they're trying to be comfortable, it's because they have so much honor and respect they can go to school. They take their shoes off when they get to go to school. If you look in the front, you can see they have their shoes off. This is in Pakistan in Chunda village, a quite conservative area, in August 2007. My kids, Khyber and Amira, and then the education director, they opened up a school in Chunda village. It took us 8 years, from 1999 to 2007, to convince the mullah there to send one girl to go to school. Thousands of cups of tea, maybe more. And when we opened up the school, there were 74 girls in school that day. Today in Chunda village, there are 350 girls going to school, and the imam sits right by the doorstep and he takes attendance to make sure even more girls come to school every day. You know, Haji Ali and my father, they taught me that it's so important to listen. So I try to listen, and I ask women, like in rural Pakistan, Afghanistan, how can I help you and what would you like? So you'd think most women would say, I want a good husband, I want a big house, or I want prosperity. But what most women tell me are two simple things. We don't want our babies to die, and we want our children to go to school. It really was the peaks that first brought us there, but the people who bring us back and back again. When I got to Corfe in early 2001, Haji Ali's wife, Sakina, had passed away, and they'd been married about 6 decades. He was actually quite distraught. And in a very rare moment of sentiment, he said to me, without her, I'm nothing. And then he said something, you know, we were standing by her box. She was buried in a little box facing the west towards the sunset, towards Mecca, where she'd said her prayers every day. And then in a rare moment of sentiment, he said to me, without her, I'm nothing. And then he said something that I'd never forget. He said, soon you'll be standing here, and I'm going to be in the ground. And he kind of chuckled, and I didn't think it was very funny because I lost my father and my sister, and all of us here, we've lost somebody dear to us, and you never get over that. He said, when that moment happens, I want you to do one thing. I want you to listen to the wind. So when I got back to Corfe in October 2001, and I was in Pakistan 3 months before and after 9/11, Haji Ali had passed away. And so when I got to his grave, it was a little box facing in the dirt towards the sunset. I was very sad, just as he predicted. And then I remembered what he said. He said that I should listen to the wind. So I listened to the wind. In the wind, I heard the voices of the children in the school. And I realized his legacy and vision had come true through the education of his children. Haji Ali, he loved to read. In the evening, he sat on a charfoise, like a little rickety bed with 4 poles and a little kerosene lantern, and he'd read quite a bit. But he only read 2 books. He read the Holy Quran and Persian poetry. He had thick goggle glasses, and he'd hold the book up close to his eye. But often when he read, I noticed he would have a tear in his eye, or he was kind of sad. So one day I asked Haji, why are you sad when you read? He said, Greg, actually, I don't know how to read, and I memorize these books. And then he showed me how every 4th page he had flipped the page, or he put in twigs or a little piece of paper. He said, I memorize these books. It's my life's greatest tragedy that I never learned how to read and write. It's my life's greatest hope that my children can learn to read and write. And then in his words, he said, these words make the stories that make wise the fools. And by fools, he meant illiteracy and ignorance. And I also realized that after a decade, that finally I had come full circle, because I hadn't found the field of dreams in a cornfield in Iowa, and I hadn't found the field of dreams on top of a big bad mountain called K2, but I had found the field of dreams in a little dusty village, a place called Corfe in Pakistan. So life goes on today. We're we've now gone, we're doing a lot of work in Afghanistan. I think we have 14 or 15 schools. We're building several more. We're working also in Kunar province. Now we're able to get schools set up in a very volatile area. And again, it's all built on relationships. We also are continuing with our teacher training program and now more and more scholarships. Just to give you 2 things that happened. There's a young woman named Fozia, who's from Azad, Kashmir. She just passed her bar exams last year. She's the first female attorney to come out of 4 million people in Azad, Kashmir. Now, there's a lot of other women who went to the cities and got their degree, but she's the first, we say, homegrown, home-educated woman. Now she's attorney, and she's 2 years here now in the U.S. She wants to go back and become a women's advocate. Shakila, who's in 3 cups of tea, she's in her 4th year of medical school in Lahore in Pakistan at Our Lady of Fatima College. She's scoring in the 90s, and She's going to become the first physician out of 1.2 million people to become a physician. She's going to go back to where she wants to work. And her dad tried to get her to go into education. She said, because he said being a doctor is too messy. But she said, no, I want to be a doctor. And so she's going to be finishing up here in the next year. I was in a 4th grade class in Houston, Texas, and the kids there were trying to read the adult book. So I called my wife, Tara, and we talked to Julia, and Julia got one of her close friends, Susan Roth. So now a young reader's book has been, a children's book called Listen to the Wind has been published, and it tells the children about the story of the children in Corfe, and it's done in collage, and a very beautiful book, and it's now been the New York Times bestseller for children's books for, about 5 weeks. And then 3 Cups of Tea Young Reader's book, which this was very exciting, inspiring to write. I have a pile of about 2,000 criticisms and letters and complaints and emails about 3 Cups of Tea at home, so I went through those very carefully. And then I talked to lots of teachers and educators and librarians and even students. So in this book now is a glossary, a timeline, a who's who, more diagrams, more charts, more maps and more photos and all that kind of stuff. And also there is a 20-page Q&A with my 12-year-old daughter, Mira. And one question is, how does it feel the day your dad goes to Pakistan, Afghanistan for a couple months, or he's gone? And she says, well, this is Amira talking. We wake up and we're kind of sad. Then we take Daddy to the airport and we hug him a bit, and then we cry, but not a ton. Then we go to school, and as the school day goes on, we get happier because we know when we get home, Daddy will be there because he missed his flight. That's very true. And we're finishing up a second book called Stones into Schools, but it takes place more in Afghanistan. But what I'm really trying to do in this book is bring out the incredible stories of determination and courage that are happening through education, how education is transforming people's lives, and not only in Afghanistan, Pakistan, but all over the world today. I guess the message I'd like to leave last of all is that I read a U.S. News report. Did I already talk about this? Good. Julius, but I've been giving too many talks every day. I get mixed up. I read a U.S. News report about a year and a half ago, and it said that in 1970, about 1/3 of college graduates want to go out and make a difference in the world. In 1970 was the days of the peace sign and bell-bottom jeans and guitars and all that stuff. One generation later, by 1990, 20 years later, only 18% of college graduates say they want to go out and make a difference. Everybody want to go out and make a buck. Today, which is now 20 years later almost, another generation later, 40% of college graduates say they want to go out and make a difference in the world. And if you look at it's been very exciting. When I go to universities, I look at the curriculum. I've looked at some of the great classes here in a city college. And you'll see that political science is now turning more into international relations. Architecture and engineering is looking at socially responsible engineering. Business is looking at ethical entrepreneurship. Nursing and medicine is looking at holistic health rather than symptomatic treatment of diseases. Education is looking at more holistic approaches to education. Here at City College, Abdul Jabbar and the university are spearheaded studies in Islamic studies driven by interest in the students. That was 7 years ago. And what happened is the class got filled out immediately and was popping at the seams. There wasn't enough space to accommodate all the students. And if you talk to some chancellors or presidents or administration, they say, well, we can take some credit, but the main reason that's happening is because it's driven by students. Students really want to make the world a better place, and they want a more holistic type of education. So that gets me really fired up, because if you look at what's happening there, and then you go down to the high school and the elementary school later, there's kids there, I think 60% are going to want to go out and make the world a better place. So we cannot exude trepidation or fear or anxiety, or we cannot, we can't be continuing to fight terrorism and spend billions and billions of dollars to build high walls around America. What we need to do is promote peace, and that's based in hope. And also, most of all, I think, that we should know that what Martin Luther King said is that even if the world ends tomorrow, we're still going to plant our seed today. And I think that seed of hope starts here, right in schools with education, literacy. So thank you very much, and Chancellor Griffin, thank you for having me here, and Honorable Council, thank you.